Welcome to Billy Coco Presents Side Project Spotlight, episode 13. This is a developer's journey into making cool stuff. We are your partners on this epic adventure. I'm Kotaro.
I'm Steve.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are Philly Coco, a Philadelphia-based Coco Heads community focused on Apple development. That primarily, but not exclusively, means iOS, Mac, tvOS, and watchOS development. Philly Coco's prime directive is to help you along your own development journey. Whew. All right.
Did it.
I did it. Whew. They're getting better. I'm adding little tweaks every day. Or not every day, every episode. Oof, jeez, that'd be a nightmare if it was every day. So last week we had a wonderful guest, Arpit, to talk about his grocery timer app. I have to say that's been our best viewed episode so far, which is amazing. So now we were lucky to get another guest, one of our colleagues and friends, Sean Najera. He is a senior mobile developer at Newly. Sean, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
Could you describe what kind of company Newly is and what you do at Newly?
So Newly is a clothing rental subscription service where you can select up to 6 pieces of clothing, and once a month they'll deliver it to you. At the end of the month, you return it, and then your next 6 come back. Your next 6 items of clothing that you pick for next month will get returned to you immediately after you postmark your return. So it's really fast turnaround time. And I handle the iOS app where people can browse what sort of items are available, and also deal with other service-related issues that come up with that sort of rental subscription service. But I actually like to tell people it's like the old school Netflix, where you used to actually get the DVDs mailed to you, which, at the time I thought was fascinating. It was amazing. And when they got rid of it, I was so sad. I thought, oh, they're done for. There's no way Netflix can survive without getting, mailing DVDs to people.
I thought you could still get DVDs. There's like a DVD button on my Netflix screen.
That I assume that is like deep dive in the settings.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was like a separate
into the settings section, and then they say, oh, that's an extra like $14 to $20 cost.
Yeah, well, it's definitely different.
Cost.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they used to give you the option of both, and then you had to pick one. And so, of course, I picked online service, but for some reason, I still thought in my mind, like, oh, there's no way that many people would want to watch, stuff on their laptop like me, how I'm doing, and then,
Yeah.
And then I was wrong. So,
do you create like a queue of clothing, like a queue of DVDs back in the day? You don't necessarily plan that far ahead. I remember I had to create like a queue like months in advance. It would just go down.
Steve, it's not a queue; it's a closet.
It's a closet. Okay, that makes much more sense. That's a better metaphor.
Wow, so it's an infinite closet. Is that how that works? But it is a closet with a queue, right? So it's not like you can you can technically hot swap the closet, like move some like your fall fashion up a little bit forward if you want to.
Yeah, to Steve's question, there's actually no queue. They do that on purpose for inventory services. It's in real time, and at any moment, things can go in and out of stock. Things can be taken up by another Newly subscriber instantaneously. It's actually really interesting. I just finished work on the back end where we handle inventory through an Android app, where people that work at the warehouse have an Android app scanning device that runs the Android operating system. And as soon as the items come back from a Newly customer, or as soon as the vendors deliver us a new batch of garments inventory, and they scan it into the system, it immediately shows up on the website.
Wow.
Wow.
Seconds, minute max later. It's really interesting. So in that sense, it's so fast that having a queue, especially with this, with this business model, is almost impractical because things are flying off the shelves. They're flying off the shelf, Steve. You can't get them in and out, and let them and have them be in some sort of like ready static state. So what we do actually is have just a closet of where people can like clothing for the next time that their return is supposed to come out. So it's funny. It's actually really rudimentary on the app. It's literally just a closet of liked items, and it's you assumedly, for the next month's 6 picks, you just go into your closet and see what's still there. If it's there, then you just add it to your 6, press submit, and those are the 6 you're going to get. But there's no, it's funny because I asked that at one of our retros. I thought, well, why don't we have a queuing system like in Netflix, so that as soon as next month comes up, you don't have to fuss with it like you do now. It just, those are the 6 you pick, and then those are going to go out. That's what will be shipped to you immediately. No user interaction required. But then, just for the reasons I mentioned, they can't really do that because things are changing very fast. It's impractical at the moment.
Makes sense. And so you did the iOS app that would let me choose that.
Yeah, that's
not the only app that Newly provides, or no, only service, I should say.
So last year, Newly came up with the idea of having a Poshmark competitor, which is an online thrift forum / market for people who want to sell their secondhand used items on some sort of marketplace. Think of it like eBay, but just for clothing. That's what the Poshmark's business model is. And the interesting thing about Newly doing it is that in this new app that actually Kotaro and I were on the same team again last year developing, you not only have third-party customers selling to third-party sellers, but Newly itself is a third-party seller, because once you have an article of clothing that has gone, in and out from being rented and being returned over the course of, maybe a year and a half, that item gets to a point where you can't really rent it out in the same way that you could when it was brand new a year and a half ago. So they'll take those items that have been retired from the Newly rental service, and then they'll put it on the Newly thrift service to sell it in the secondhand clothing market that they've created for themselves.
It's kind of like they created an AWS for clothing. So they had this.
I was thinking much more like Facebook Market
or Facebook. Well, yeah, but I mean, like, as a business, they had this product that wears out for their main rental service, and so they just like, let's just build an entirely new business that can then take our recycle our other stuff. So they're very environmentally sound too.
So this is somewhat of a what do you call that? A transition, because you've done both iOS and Android. In fact, I think you come from an Android background, if I remember correctly, before you got into iOS development. And this is strictly, in this case, I believe it was all native work for Newly related work, like Kotlin and Swift or UIKit.
It was actually back when Java was the primary language when developing Android apps. Mm-hmm. That was the first language after Python and some other statistical languages for statistical analysis that I learned in college. And that was back in 2016. So not too long ago, but just as the second wave of Android development came about, as I like to say, maybe third wave. Some people like to break it up into finer chunks.
Oh, that's fascinating. So what? So I guess, can you describe those waves?
So in 2017, that's when Android development became, in my mind, I guess it was for me because that was my first wave, but there were different waves in the past. But that was when Android came out with its architecture components, later to turn into Jetpack Compose, Android X libraries, which are sort of like the kits in iOS, like Photo Kit, Map Kit, but totally revamped, 100% designed for today's modern apps. In the before, you used to have to set up some gnarly boilerplate. We're talking, weeks of work, depending on how complex your model was. But we're in a non-trivial amount of work to set up a database backend for your app. Yeah, on-device storage.
So something similar to like Core Data's interface, or something of that nature. Interesting.
But even more boilerplatey than Core Data. It really was tedious, just all the code you had to set up for it. And then they came out in 2017 with Room Database, which replaced all of that with 3 files, per model, and maybe 100 lines of code in each, in one particular file that I can think of, max. To do all your CRUD operations on the model. So insert, update, delete, very, very small footprint, very easily integrated into your app, very easy to make migrations. And it was amazing. And it also supported RX Java and other Reactive-based streams. So with no code of your own to write, you could actually set up very trivially a get query to return a list of items either once, or return a reactive stream of items with filters, sorts, all included. Very, very nice, easy API that would update every single time that the results of that query would ever change. So let's say you inserted a new item in the database at some point in the future. If you're still observing that query for that list of items and you add a new one, that query would get updated, and in the reactive stream that it returns, the reactive stream would update with that new list of items to your UI automatically. It was amazing. It was really, so usually at Google I/O, people don't clap every 5 seconds like they do at WWDC. They really make you earn those claps. But when they said Room supports RX Java, everybody stood up and clapped. And I was just like, oh, whoa, this is mind blowing. Nobody claps.
Really? Wow, it's a tough crowd then.
And so that was sort of the, those sorts of new libraries and other ones. So they had one called View Model, which, long story short, handles the rotation problem on Android, whereby when you rotate the device to enter a new orientation, so from portrait to landscape, it deallocates all memory of your activity, which is equivalent to a view controller, and then reinitializes everything. And if your activity has fragments embedded into it, and those fragments have fragments embedded into it, then all of those get removed from memory and have to be reinitialized. And it was a major pain to have to do it on your own. So they came out with a library that helped, that facilitated with that. Again, just removing all the ancient boilerplate that you had to do with Android development. And then from then on, it just got better. So in Google I/O 2018, they announced first-party support for Kotlin. In follow-up years, they announced Jetpack Compose, which is similar to Swift UI, which is now fully feature complete. I wouldn't say fully feature complete, but if you compared where Swift UI is now to where Jetpack Compose is now for Android, it's practically feature complete, relatively speaking.
Interesting. So if you were to compare the two, which do you think is further along in terms of its maturity, I should say?
Definitely Jetpack Compose for Android. So Swift UI and Jetpack Compose are both declarative frameworks for UI, for the UI in terms of development. And I remember when we started at Slice developing Flutter apps, and it was very much a declarative UI. That's what Flutter went with right off the bat. So they all of their UI layer is declarative based. And we had been working on that app back in 2019, I think starting April. And that's when I got used to the declarative system of Flutter and a little bit of React Native. In the same way that there are component-based view elements that you don't really so much as modify in place, but you just sort of emit new composable elements when state changes, when a backing state of that UI changes. So you're not showing and hiding things like you do in UIKit. You're not embedding things into views that are already there. You just say, if this state, then compose this UI. If that state, compose that UI. And everything is very much reactive or declarative. If you come from a reactive programming background.
So you getting into sort of the Flutter, I remember we talked about wanting to talk about your Flutter experience in that regard. What was the initial reasoning for picking Flutter as a technology? Because I remember, I don't know how young Flutter was at that time, but I vaguely remember to pick Flutter at that period of time was still pretty what's the
gutsy
term? Gutsy, yes, thank you.
It was untested or unproven.
I mean, it was still
maybe?
young, is the way I interpret it back in the day. When
we started, when we started it in 2019, it was, I want to say, oh man, I think it was 1.4. And if you want to take 1.0 as the most stable that you would use, the most stable version you would use for any sort of client app, then probably 2 years of Flutter before then had been sort of brewing, sort of developing by the time we got to it in 2019, April. So I have to say, given that it was that short amount of time, it was pretty functional. UI for both Android and iOS was consistent, not perfect. There were some issues, especially when we had to do fairly technical custom things like embed video into some of the views. Sometimes the video wasn't quite rendering correctly to the correct aspect ratio on certain Android devices. That was it though, except for the video stuff that we did. In terms of just your basic UI, a list of items, you click on a list and it takes you to a detailed page. Everything basic or standard, I should say, in mobile development was pretty solid in Flutter. The only thing all of us had to learn at the time, we were all fairly new to it, was this declarative UI system. It didn't take that long though. We're talking maybe 2-3 weeks of of discovery. And once we understood the declarative UI model way of thinking, we all loved it. The Android developers loved it. The iOS developers loved it. And we were able to iterate very fast on UI development. And it was very much a breath of fresh air from our UI kit and Android view system background. And I can't speak to React. We did a little POC before we went with Flutter to see how both React and Flutter fared when we thought about building this this proof of concept. And we just went with Flutter because it was something more familiar to the mobile developers. But we absolutely loved it, more so than I thought I was going to, the declarative UI. And again, April 2019. So the next month, May 2019, WWDC, when Apple released or announced SwiftUI, our jaws just dropped. And then, because we thought this is amazing, we just literally just spent all of this time investing in declarative UI. So there you go. And then the following month, when in June 2019, when Google I/O usually happens, they announced Jetpack Compose. We're like, all right, everybody's on board with declarative UI. This is great. We just have to wait and see.
Oh, so that's kind of interesting. Did that change your perspective of picking Flutter, or did you, at that point, was that a commitment? Like, all right, it's great that they're doing it, but they're probably still young, which was true. The SwiftUI and Jetpack Compose, and you were just like, we're still going down the Flutter route. In many ways, when you chose Flutter, I assume cross-platform was another reason why you chose that as one of the reasons why you went around it. How did that? And so to do cross-platform development, you can have one code base to sort of rule them all ish. What are the complications with that approach that you run across? Where like it kind of butts up against like the native, versus like a native solution where you run into complications there.
I would say for your standard UI layouts, Flutter did a very good job with developing our proof of concept app. I was very surprised because I was in the camp of let's just separate out the developers and into iOS and Android backgrounds, and let's just develop a native app separately in sync with each other. I have to say that I was very much wrong in that sense for this POC proof of concept app that we were developing, because having all of the developers work on the same code base made us go a lot faster than separating it out into two native apps. I was really shocked at how quickly we were able to iterate, and that's the benefit you get from Flutter, which is probably everybody's noted before. That you can your iterations are quicker just because it's one code base, and it really is. But I guess I had to prove that to myself. Just to see it firsthand.
Was Slice the place where you did a lot of heavy unit testing? And was that something that, I guess that was not the place in terms of like proof of like whether or not Flutter is good for that, for encouraging that kind of style of programming, the TDD style, or sort of allowing for easier unit testing to be.
You could do unit tests in Flutter, and I tried to do them wherever I could, but this proof of concept was not complex, but there were a lot of so where Flutter shines is when you have standard standard mobile UI layouts that are list views, detail views, scrolling, those sorts of standard mobile UI views. Where we ran into trouble was trying to do things that were custom to the device, like interacting with the camera. That was something that we had to do for our Slice proof of concept. Slice being the company where we were at that did image recognition software. So we dealt with the camera APIs a lot, and running into issues with the camera was probably the first hurdle that we had to go over. The second one was video rendering, and I think that was just the very very young state of this one video AP library that we were using to render video in the app. And then the third one was just the Slice image recognition software SDK that we had built for Android and iOS. We had to make calls into that at the native layer from the Flutter app, and they had to be different for iOS and Android. And so running into consistency issues when you crossed from Flutter into native, those were, I can't remember exactly what some issues were, but just sometimes it would be slower on Android. And having to, usually it was because of the SDK itself, the native SDK that we had created. But sometimes it would just be slow for, if you think about it, we would need information from the native SDK, and the SDK had all these APIs, like get image ID, get image type, or calculate image type. And so calling all of those SDK APIs from Flutter going into the native layer, it would just sometimes be slow. And so you had to account for that in the app.
I do remember watching a friend sort of demonstrate how the workflows work in terms of like first doing the work in Flutter. I think he used the Android IDE, Android Studio, to sort of like do all the sort of building of the app itself, and then to do the export, to export in both an Android project and an iOS project. The iOS project to build the iOS project would take forever. And so I wonder, from an iOS developer standpoint, like what are the frustration points of, like, I could see myself getting frustrated coming from like, okay, like doing this natively, I'm already in Xcode, I'm already comfortable, having the extra layer of doing this in whether it be Visual Studio Code or whatever, and then running a command line to construct or to update my Xcode project, for which then I'd then have to do another build and compile. How does Flutter sort of litigate that, for lack of a better word?
I remember going and downloading Android Studio for Flutter, or was it the plugin? I remember downloading the plugin for Flutter in Android Studio, and as I recall, it was so bad that I actually had to use the VS Code version. So I actually instead of using Android Studio, which I'm guessing that has changed. It's been 3 years. I'm going to assume that the Android Studio Flutter plugin is a lot better, but at the time, it was slower, and the tooling wasn't as good. So I actually just used the VS Code Flutter version, or IDE and tooling, and that was a lot better. So I don't know if that might have helped back then. It helped me. And as I recall, for building for both iOS and Android, when it was time to export, I don't remember that many issues with build times. Yeah, I have to say my experience was fairly positive, especially in terms of the tooling. Once I started using the VS Code IDE and plugin for Flutter, it was 3 years ago, so maybe I've just blocked all of those terrible pain points from my memory.
So I guess it is kind of fascinating. I guess if you were a development studio, and I guess we can kind of like break them up into like small, medium, and large companies, and you wanted to build a cross-platform application, even for nothing more than being sort of like a conduit for like an online service that you're providing, would you start with Flutter, or would you still prefer to do it in native? Would you still recommend native? And I guess I guess it's always a depend question, right? So,
or is
like,
there some other better platform now for cross-platform? That's what I want to know.
Unity.
Yeah,
just kidding. just kidding. Just kidding. Even though it's a great cross-platform environment in my mind.
You know,
For games.
Great. No, that's a great question.
It's layered for sure.
I don't even know. I think I want to start with this. I think if you're the type of shop that has a lot of web developers, front end developers, and your product is a mature web app, and let's say you wrote that web app in React, which is, I think, still the most popular front end web framework to date. So it's more than likely that your mature web app is in React. If you're going to go with a native solution, one of the interesting things that I've discussed with managers and HR personnel is that it's very difficult to hire good mobile developers. I can only imagine that it's even more difficult now. So you might be better off with developing a React Native app, if for no other reason than you have a bunch of people that know React. And I can't stress it enough. I think it would have been the same had we chosen React Native instead of Flutter at Slice. But the iteration speed, development time, it's much faster when you have all your developers working on one project. It just is. And when you have to get into the nitty gritty of the specific native platforms, there can be some slowness. But if you're just doing a proof of concept, or if you need to build your mobile app now rather than later, and you're primarily a web shop that uses React, maybe even, I would probably go with React as your best bet, just to get something out the door. And playing with React a little bit a few years ago, it wasn't, I don't remember it being that terrible. And what's interesting is that Flutter is sort of this in-between solution where if you have mobile devs for iOS and Android, and you want to build something cross-platform because it's quick, then you have Flutter. But if you have mobile devs, then they're probably going to advocate for building iOS and Android separately. If you're primarily a web shop and you have a web app, you could go with Flutter, but you probably already know JavaScript and a little bit of React. So you're probably going to go React. I think it speaks volumes that Flutter is doing so well, even though it's sort of the in-between choice. And I will say that the thing about Flutter is that it's not just a mobile cross-platform framework. It also you can also build Mac OS apps. You can build Windows apps. You can build you can build web apps now in Flutter. They're actually targeting a lot of different platforms, and
I think you can build a tvOS app now, if I remember correctly. To check.
That's right. They were having bitcode issues back in 2019, but I think once they solved that, then it opened the door for all the other OSs on Apple's on Apple platforms. So I think just the versatility of Flutter, and what they've been able to do and how they're gaining, if not, I think surpassing React Native at this point, speaks volumes. The only thing is that you have to learn Dart, and Dart is a poor man's Java, and that is saying a lot.
Spicy take. I mean, you do come from a Java background, so
I do.
I always say that like C# is a better version of Java, and that would make Java people mad. And you're saying Dart is like a worse version of Java.
That's a ringing endorsement.
Yeah, I've never used Dart, so I don't know, but that actually gives me like an image in my mind about what I'm going to look at.
I mean, I feel like Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you study, what all these different programming languages are trying to do now, so async await now in Swift, combine, in Swift, the Reactive framework, first-party React framework for Apple, all the Apple OSs. All of that was inspired by C#, because C# was doing all of that stuff years ago. And I have to say, I don't know C# at all, but C# it seems like a really amazing language, and yet everybody's like, oh, did you hear about Rust, async await and Rust? And didn't C# have all of that a long time ago?
Every time someone has one of these new features, I have the same reaction like lately about Swift, like, oh, look at this amazing await, async await, and I'm like, yeah, that's been in like C# for I don't know how many years. It's like, I'm glad you're finally catching up to the language that most developers in like the Philly area like are probably using. It's just not a cool language because it's probably because it's mostly enterprises, and education and like that kind of thing. So,
I mean, it was kind of like the interesting when Mono.
It sounds like a disease.
I know. Is there a full name for that? I keep forgetting. It's Mono, right? It's just Mono.
Yeah, I thought it was Mono. Yeah. It's just I don't want to say I got mono over here.
It's not like, we're gonna get demonetized. We don't make any money anyway.
It's like, hey, go through. Want to check out this new version of mono I got? I mean, it just
I'm still messing with the Rona. Okay.
Yes. Naming is hard. Naming is hard.
Like, you had a choice when in the early days of Unity, the game engine. You had a choice between like a bastardized version of JavaScript or mono C#, and majority of the time, people just stuck with C# because that was the much more natural language to use.
And that wasn't even, and mono was independent like .NET implementation, right? So it wasn't even Microsoft. I think they're all one company. I think they bought them years ago. So
I believe so.
Yeah, I think so. So that stuff that I think that's the evolution of that is what if you run like Visual Studio or something on a Mac, I think that's what it uses that like historically. I think it's all kind of commingled now, and they re-implemented a lot of stuff on the .NET Core side. But yeah, the mono that whole project has gone very far. It really has.
Yes. So I think I guess it's kind of interesting because I remember thinking about Flutter when I would watch videos about it and going, oh, it's like a game engine. I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of like it uses, at the time I think it was OpenGL, but now they've moved over to a different 3D engine, if I remember.
Skia. The rendering engine. That's the interesting thing also about Flutter is that, React Native at the time, I want to say React Native has updated the way it renders, but React Native would just render, for the most part, UI components in the individual in the individual platforms. So on iOS, it would render a button this way, and on Android, it would render a button that way. So it was just sort of a middleman. Whereas Flutter would take over the entire screen and render UI components in its own native rendering engine. I don't know if they still use Skia. I don't know if things have changed, but it made it faster for a lot of use cases in that sense compared to React. And that, again, another React Native, another reason why probably Flutter gained that critical, critical mass of followers back in the day, and how it's propelled them to where they needed to be now. Again, yeah, no, I enjoyed Flutter development for the most part. It was I would say my biggest gripe was just learning Dart. I can only tell you that you just got to go look at the Dart language, and they have made some updates. But back in 2019, for example, a key missing feature was that they did not have null safety.
No null safety.
No null safety. So you had to do everywhere where you thought it would possibly be null a value, if value equals null everywhere. Again, just like a Java, the Java languages. I still think Java has no null safety. But in Kotlin and Swift, for example, you have the question mark operator for easy null safety, right? You just check, is this null value? Can I unwrap it safely? No, well then do something else. But basically, it ensures no runtime crashes for accidental null pointer exceptions. Dart didn't have that. 2019, it doesn't have that. Where
and C# has it too.
Yes.
C# has everything.
Oh, come on!
I can imagine. I just imagine like
C.
Yeah.
There's a party. There's like all these programming languages are at a party, and Rust and Swift and Kotlin, they're all talking up a storm, right? The crowd is laughing, and then C# is like, "Hey guys, I came up with that." Like, shut up, C#.
Yeah. I don't know who came first. I don't know when it came to C#, but there's like question marks and stuff in there. I don't think it was I don't know. I haven't looked at a lot of like recent other people's C# code, but I'm not sure how widespread use it was, because I remember I didn't use it for a long time. Like a lot of the projects that I have, because they're older, didn't have it, but it's in there now. There's like a whole null safety in C# tutorial on Microsoft's website. It's the language that either created a lot of this good stuff, or it just it adopts everything. It's kind of like Swift, but I feel like it's more organized than the Swift evolution. It's like less chaotic.
Well, it is
less
pretty
chaotic.
funny, because it's almost like every proposal imaginable gets submitted.
Yeah.
So like I heard recently a one, I think it's still in proposal. I'm not sure if it's been approved, but there's the if let variable equals self out, whatever. Like the one thing that is an optional, right? So you always have this consistent if let variable equals variable, right? You do that a lot in Swift to check if it's nil or not, if there's a value inside that var or constant or whatever, and you just convert it into a constant. Whereas they get rid of the equal, so you can just do something like if let var if let variable, and then that's it. Like it gets rid of the check, so to speak. So you can instantly, it's like a shorthand to just instantly assign a variable to the option from the optional. Which I thought was funny.
It's on the Swift forums as if let shorthand.
Yeah.
So let's say you have some sort of property that's optional. So you have some foo somewhere and it's an optional.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying if let, I need to come up with a name for this local version. If let local foo, or if let valid foo equals foo, else do something. If in the nil case, they'll just let you write if let foo else, and then in the nil case, but it lets you unwrap foo in place without having to come up with a local variable name to unwrap it.
Yeah, it's those type of like shorthands that like are probably nice, but also like, oh geez, I can tell like the there's gonna be some angry mob debates going on Twitter about it.
Yeah. About
so
style
kind of
and when to use it. Yeah, developers love to argue.
Sure. Speaking of argue in that sense, I know Steve not Steve, Sean, you've had a major gripe of SwiftUI that you've worked on a solution for, which is great. Something called Navigator. So if you can sort of describe, it's a great library that people should try out. We'll probably post a link somewhere in the podcast descriptions. But if you can kind of describe what this is and what problem you're trying to solve with this library, SwiftUI library.
Right. So SwiftUI, again, going back into the time machine, when SwiftUI was announced, I was very excited because I know that I knew, because of how well Flutter worked, and even then that could have been improved, that declarative UI was just better for faster iterations. So when SwiftUI was announced and you had first party declarative UI support, I thought, this is amazing. This is I am in my element. It is my time to shine. However, as we've seen in now year 3 of SwiftUI, especially compared to the feature completeness of Jetpack Compose, Android's declarative UI framework, it's so close, but it's not quite there yet to be a fully standalone UI framework for iOS, let alone all the other Apple OSs, without dropping down into UIKit, which is fine. They have some great APIs to handle the case where you need to bring in UIKit or AppKit for something that's not fully baked into SwiftUI. But I would say one of the most egregious offenses of SwiftUI is navigation view and navigation link, which are the only way to do a push-based navigation style in SwiftUI natively without doing any sort of custom view transitions and animations. And yet it's very difficult to create a navigation view with views in that navigation view stack that are not tightly coupled to one another, to the root view, and that lend themselves to developers getting into all sorts of trouble with everything from not so bad but to very bad. Not so bad, the best case scenario is you just have a lot of spaghetti code for keeping track of which view is active in your navigation view, to the very bad of you cannot do some of the basic things without all sorts of bugs. And these are pop to root. Let's say you're 5 views in your navigation view. How are you going to pop to root? And then as well as dynamic navigation. It could be that you have this flow, and the one that comes to mind is the sign up flow. And you have different forms for each view in your sign up process. Let's say you have four views, a different form on each view. And you code it in such a way that view 1 comes after view 2 comes after view 1, 3 after 2, et cetera, et cetera. But now you want to insert another view in between 2 and 3. And with the way that navigation links work, which is the only way to push onto the stack another view, is you have to hard code the view that comes next in that navigation link, much like prepare for Segway in the old storyboard development style in UIKit. But unlike UIKit, where you had the option of manually pushing UI view controllers onto the navigation, the UI navigation view, there's no other option. You have to use navigation link, which again is just requires the developer to hard code the next view. It requires the previous view to have knowledge of the next view. And so it just leads to unnecessary coupling. And when I say unnecessarily, I mean that it could have been done a different way. And I wish it would have, I wish it had been, because you see all of these Stack Overflow questions about, how do I have dynamically navigable views? How do I create a stack of views programmatically without hard coding? And it's just, this person did it this way, and it's boilerplatey, it's gnarly. You're passing around Boolean values all over the place, or you have to go through some sort of central view model in order to, sort of act as the source of truth for your navigation flow. It's very difficult, needless to say. And so the library that I came up with was a way for you to handle navigation in navigation view natively. So we're still using navigation view, and we're still pushing views onto the navigation view in the same way that navigation link did, but we're using a simpler API, and that lets you, let's say, create a button. And when the user presses this button, you can have it such that you have this navigator object, and all this navigator object does is it forwards the next view you want to navigate to its internal sort of navigation state. And the navigator will handle keeping track of how many views are on the navigation view stack. It'll keep track of where we're going into the next view, and it all happens at runtime. So you can have a completely dynamic, completely stateless navigation experience in Swift UI. I don't know if I hope I'm explaining that as best as I can.
All you had to say was it has its own push pop mechanic, which is and pop to root, which I was like, oh, that is nice.
Anyone using Swift UI will appreciate it. I know we had a issue with Kanji Love, just a little watch app that we did with that same kind of scenario, Sean, where you were describing the you have like a flow from one to the next and next, and we did that, and then we were trying to have that be slightly dynamic, and we was like, how do we get this to work, and how do we go back from the end of that to like earlier in the stack? Like we had that actual problem happen, and that was just in a watch app with a handful of screens, and that's when it really struck me, like, oh my god, this is kind of a broken API. Like this is, you run into this doing the simplest things. It's frustrating.
It's very clear in the scenario of like deep linking, where maybe you want to get into a specific dynamic flow, but then you just want to get back to root if that flow doesn't exist or something of that nature, right? Or you want to have much more dynamic control, but you still want to set up the like, okay, I want this detail view, right? Inside a list view, right? So it's like 3 layers deep. And then I want it to not necessarily pop to root, but pop back to the local list view, and then back to you want to create the hierarchy in that deep link, and then be able to like drill back if the user wants to. That makes sense from an architectural standpoint. So this library, I think, is really useful for that, which we haven't implemented, by the way, but we probably should.
Sean gave a great demo of his library to us before at a Philly Coca. I don't know if it was Side Project Saturday or was it a regular meeting or both. but it was great. It was like one of those demos that we should have recorded because it could live forever as like a symbol of greatness in the future. Maybe if they Sherlock you at WWDC this year, will you be happy or like sad?
I will be happy because when, let's put it this way, I'll be happy the next year when they Sherlock me the previous year and then they fix the bugs of the previous year and then it's good. So I'll be happy in 2 years. I just wanted to note that if you the use case Kotaro that you were saying, deep linking, that's probably the number one feature that's lacking in SwiftUI's base navigation APIs. They really leave you to handle it all yourself, but it's not easy to do something like that with the current navigation system in SwiftUI. But I like to tell people that let's say you're on the music app and you're listening to a song and it says, you click on the overflow menu and you say view album, view this song's album, and you could be anywhere in the music app. So you then have to pop back to root, and then you have to pop into, let's say, the artist detail page, and then you push into the artist detail page from root, and then you push into that specific album's detail. And we're not even talking about handling the different tabs you could be on. Something like that would be very, very, very difficult to implement yourself for all use cases in your app in SwiftUI. But with this Navigator app, it's a lot easier and it's a lot more straightforward, using things like you mentioned, pop to root, push stack, which lets you navigate, to first load a bunch of views on top of each other and then push the final view on top of that one that you want to go to, perfect for deep linking. That library handles all of that. So yeah, go check it out. There's a nice little GIF if you go onto the GitHub site for it that shows you what we're talking about and the dynamicness, the feature of Navigator.
So it's a public library. It's github.com/esnahara/navigate
Esnahara, yeah.
/navigator. Link will be in the show notes for sure. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Sean. It's always good to catch up with you. If people want to get in touch with you, where can they go? Where can we find you?
I don't have a Twitter. I don't have a Facebook, but you can reach me by GitHub, we'll say. Especially if you use Navigator and you see an issue that you would like addressed, I'm always open to feedback for that specific library, because it's so crucial to modern app development. If you have an issue, please let me know. I'd love it to address it and to make it that much better.
Cool. Well, again, I guess that's it for our time. So I appreciate you, Sean, for coming. And Aaron, do you have any last words you want to add?
Your one word?
Well, I don't want to make you spend another hour editing the podcast, so I don't get into like back end details of the different projects you are working on, or if you could even share them. So we'll save that for another time.
We can make it multi-parted.
Yes, multi-parted. All right. Well, you can find Philly Cocoa at phillycocoa.org, and we will see you again next time.
Did you guys decide what the next side project is? The idea of
No.
I don't think we've officially. We've been talking about various things, and Culture has been finding all these great demos. I really like the one you just showed about with the clothing. Like there was one. It was, I think it's from AR House. Is that the organization that does a lot of these? That you shared, where they took a picture of like a child's drawing, a crayon drawing of like a person with like clothes, and then they used AR something to superimpose it on an actual live person. So it was like kind of like creating virtual clothing. And that's like not even the first time you've shared something like that to the Slack where they had like a virtual clothing. I kind of like that idea because I think that's pretty cool, and you could use it in an art class, or you could just use it for fun. But you could use it in making movies, virtual costuming or in virtual sets, that kind of thing. I feel like is a useful thing for AR.
It's one of those interesting things where it's using the body pose detection. So then it allows you to detect and sort of create a 3D mesh, a rigged 3D object of whatever the person's doing. So if they're dancing or whatever, and then superimposing a 3D mesh, or figuring out what clothes they're wearing and then make a 3D mesh of it, and then layering up a drawing on top of it. So it's one of those things where it might make for a great art institution piece or something of that nature. Or one of the opportunities is figuring, and I think right now the way I'm looking at it is a lot of these sort of side projects or sort of like discovery process is figuring out like the usefulness of AR. Are we going down this sort of like sort of weird path that doesn't bear fruit of anything, or whether or not?
That's the interesting thing, is you guys are because every podcast you hear is like, oh, AR is amazing. Oh, look at this. But you guys are actually talking about like, well, what can we actually do with this that people will actually use?
And it's limited by the tools, like the actual physical hardware you have. So without some kind of imaginary right now headset or glasses, ideally, where you can just walk around with them, you have to think about, what can I do with my iPhone? Because that's the thing that's most available. And then what can I do with my iPad? Maybe, and then you can subdivide that into like the regular iPad and maybe the LiDAR based ones. Right. So then you're getting even more niche. Worse. Yeah. So you have to really think about like, what are the tools available? Because if it's something that needs LiDAR, that's really niche. Like that's not going to be most people. But if it's something that just needs a good camera on the iPhone, you can do a lot. But it's pretty taxing on the chip too. I mean, I have an iPhone 11 Pro Max, and just our simple demo would easily tax it sometimes.
It gets superheated.
Yeah, it gets warm.
And like uncomfortably warm. And the funny part is, like, me and Aaron have been experimenting. Can't go into too much details, but like my iPhone 12 mini doesn't have LiDAR, right? So, and it doesn't have certain abilities that a 13 Pro or 12 Pro would have. So I can't do the things that have, like, my scene detection is non-existent. I can't create a 3D mesh and understand the space.
Oh, really? That requires LiDAR?
Yeah. That was one of the things that I found for our current work project that we're working on. It was like the full like scene understanding framework in Reality Kit.
So what's the cheapest thing that has a LiDAR? Is it an iPad Pro?
I guess it's an iPad Pro. Like the base 11-inch iPad Pro is cheaper than the iPhone, or unless you can get a used 12 Pro or something.
Yeah, and they added LiDAR to the iPhones last year?
Yeah, the 12 Pro was the first iPhone. That's why I got it. I got it specifically for the LiDAR because I knew I wanted to do something with AR.
God,
but
what was I thinking?
Yeah. I need to get something with LiDAR in it because I have this 11 Pro and it's like useless.
I have my iPad Pro, so worst comes to worst, we just make sure it's a universal app when we do these tests, so that I can test it properly.
But you have an older iPad Pro, or do you have a newer one with the LiDAR?
I have a newer one, so it should be fine. Yeah, it has a LiDAR in it.
So everybody's LiDAR but me. I feel left out.
I don't have a LiDAR, Steve. I'm right there with you.
Still not sure like how useful or an actual useful use case, but the scene understanding stuff is really cool if you like to see the kind of things that it generates. It even like recognizes certain objects and it will classify them as like, oh, this is a table, this is the floor, this is the ceiling, this is a chair, or there's like certain things that it recognizes just from the the 3D mesh.
And that's like like machine learning combined in there. Like
and that's like you just kind of get it. You don't have to like implement like any like core ML stuff. It's just included in this API. You can just say use scene understanding with classification or something like that when you activate it.
There's like this philosophical question about like what is a table. It comes, if you do like philosophy 101, and you look at like ancient Greek philosophy or something, you say, well, how do you determine there's something that's a table? And it's actually a real. If you think about it, you're like, how come I can recognize all these things that are very different looking, but they all show up as a table? And so Apple actually had to concretize that philosophical problem in code. So they are the cutting edge of philosophy.
If a tree falls in the forest, but nobody has any LiDAR on their iPhone 11, I mean,
did it happen?
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't think they have actually. I don't think tree is one of the things that the base like, scene understanding will recognize. So it never happened.
There it is. It doesn't exist, Aaron. Apple says it doesn't. Trees don't exist.
Go through. I want to check out this new version of Mono I got.